All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to George Croft's American Music Show. Today's episode is the life and career of Kris Kristofferson, so stick around. But first, I've got some dates coming up, so come on out and see me. We're going to be May 31st, I'll be at the Reno River Festival. June 8th, I'll be at the Knights Ferry Music Festival, or it's the Knights Ferry Art and Music Festival. And then June 20th, I'll be at Red Bus Brewing. I had a previous date, June 14th, that was canceled, so we're not doing the Colusa County Fair anymore, but we're still doing the Knights Ferry Art and Music Festival and Red Bus Brewing on June 20th. So come on out and see me. We are also brought to you by Tyler & Co. Marketing, providing top-notch photography and videography services to Northern California. Tyler & Co. is your one-stop shop for social media content, product videos, commercials, promotional videos, and best of all, weddings and events. I dare you to take a quick scroll down their Instagram page at Tyler & Co. _marketing and tell me it doesn't look like a Hollywood production. If you want people to ask you who the executive producer of your wedding was, call Tyler & Co. If you want it to look like you got paid just to be in your wedding photos, call Tyler & Co. If you want the video of your first dance to look like it qualified you for the Screen Actors Guild, call Tyler & Co. And best of all, your future father-in-law is going to forgive you for everything. Everything. When he finds out how much money you're saving him on this wedding by using Tyler & Co. Marketing to capture your big day. So visit tylerandcofilms.com for all your photography needs. That's tylerandcofilms.com. So Kris Kristofferson is another one of these characters in country music that he's on the Mount Rushmore of country music songwriters and performers, and he was just such an interesting dude because of, he had many options in his life, but he chose to pursue music and kind of commit himself to the artist's struggle despite having other options. Like it was not like, Kris Kristofferson didn't have other skills. So he's born in 1936 in Brownsville, Texas, and he's born into a military family. So all of his grandparents, all of his grandfathers, his dad was in the army in World War II. His grandpa was in the army before that. Both his grandpas, hit on his dad and mom's side. He talked about his maternal grandfather, so his mom's dad, got his eye taken out with a spear in the Philippines somehow. It was just, but he just, has fond memories of him, just this cool old, grizzled veteran with, missing an eye. And, anyway, and that household was very strict and very, it sounds like he had a happy childhood and, but there was not a lot of room for messing around in the Kristofferson household. And they had a lot of, they had high expectations and high ability too. So and so as they're moving around, because his dad's in the Air Force, they're moving around the country, and Kris is kind of going from school to school, doing the kind of military brat thing. He ends up going to high school, I think in San Mateo, California. And he's doing great in sports. He's playing football, he's boxing, academically he's top, in the top of his class. And so he ends up getting something I learned for this episode. You hear the term Rhodes Scholar, people say, oh, he's a Rhodes Scholar, or that's a term that flies around. People say that wrong all the time. I've heard people say robed scholar, like they're wearing a robe, which made no sense to me. And this is why, is because a Rhodes Scholar is somebody who receives a scholarship from the Rhodes Foundation, which is it's a scholarship to Oxford. So it's this special academic scholarship that only applies to Oxford University, and it's for high achievers and high functioning people. There's been some other funny ones on that. Bill Clinton is a Rhodes Scholar, and so is Rachel Maddow, which I had no idea, but so is Kris Kristofferson. So he gets this scholarship, goes to England to go to college. He ends up with a master's degree in, I think, English literature. And I mean, and that's the level we're operating on. He's an Oxford trained master's degree holder in English literature. And so, you know, he's like, his whole life he'd been super attracted to poetry and kind of the written word. It came to him naturally to like that stuff. So that's why he picked that as a path. So he ends up joining the Army though after college, and he becomes a helicopter pilot. Now, he doesn't talk a lot about, at least in what I've seen, he doesn't seem to talk a lot about his experiences in, the Army, but he was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam. And, so after his military service, I should back up here. So he's a helicopter pilot in the Army. And then when he comes back, he is offered a position as an English teacher at West Point. So if he was going to stay in the Army, he was going to go be a teacher. And he did not want to do that. By this point, he had kind of figured out that he wanted to be a songwriter. Somehow the music bug bit him somewhere in that, during his military service. And he's decided, you know what, this whole flying helicopters thing and, being a college professor doesn't sound that appealing. I'm going to go move to Nashville and pursue music. And he's married at the time. He'd gotten married, let's see here, in like the mid 60s. And yeah, this is 1965 when he turns down West Point. And anyway, so he moves to Nashville with his family. And that pissed off a bunch of people, because you got to remember, he's got this family that has high standards, very high standards. And his mom is a very commanding woman. And he credits her both with his work ethic and his rebellion later, and his turn into drugs and alcohol later down the road. But because when she finds out that he's coming out of the Army to go be in Nashville, which is not a guarantee at all. It's not like he had something lined up. He just wanted to go there. She writes a letter disowning him and being like, you're not living up to your potential. Don't call me. Don't call our friends, until you get your life back together. She disowns him for just pursuing music. He's not even I don't think at that point he'd even really started to develop too much of a drinking and drug problem yet. I mean, it was around, but it was just the fact that he switched life paths to this very insecure route that pissed his mom off enough that she writes a letter disowning him. And what's funny about that letter, well, we'll come back to it. So, because he moves to Nashville, like I said, with no plan, and he decides that his best route is to just put himself around other writers and people. And he takes a job as a janitor at the record label where Johnny Cash is. So, and a bunch of other guys. So there's a period of time here where this Rhodes Scholar and master's degree in English holder is sweeping the floors around the music studios and taking out the trash and doing whatever, he's just getting himself around these people. And it works. I mean, he starts to develop friendships. He starts to get some successes going. And he's a very, ambitious and tenacious guy, despite that, this career track shift. It's not because he wasn't ambitious. It was just, he changed the route that he wanted. And, so he tells a funny story about how the first thing that Johnny Cash ever said to him was, and cause I guess you're not really allowed to talk to the artists. When you work for the company like that, you're not supposed to be in there, pitching yourself to people. But word kind of just gets around. And then if the artists talk to you, you can talk to them, kind of thing. But it wasn't like he wasn't just, oh, hey, you're Johnny Cash. Hi, I'm Kris. I have some songs that I wrote. It didn't work like that at all. It was, he just kept his head down, did his job. And then as he developed friendships, kind of word gets around. And so one of the first things that Johnny Cash ever says to him is a mutual friend in the building had somehow got his hands on that letter from Chris's mom, because in the letter she says, I don't know why you've decided to, to change your life and do this and be like these people. And like, it sounds like you want to be like Johnny Cash, who is a known drug abuser and blah, 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 blah. So she kind of, talks some trash on Johnny Cash in this letter. And Johnny Cash thought it was great. He just, it was just funny to him. So here's this letter floating around the office with Kris's mom disowning him because he moved to Nashville. And one of the first things that Johnny Cash ever said to Kris was like, he walked up to him in the hallway and was like, "It's great getting letters from home, isn't it?" And then, they kind of just laugh about it and, continue on their merry way. And then, things, like I said, things start to progress here pretty quickly because once he starts getting established as a songwriter, he does, it sounds like mostly his vice was alcohol for the most part. And it sounds like he was a pretty nasty drunk when he wanted to be. And he smoked a lot of weed, but it doesn't sound like he was doing a ton of other stuff. And I know he says that he never did heroin or anything like that. So he stayed away from the really hard stuff. There's pills and coke and all kinds of stuff around, but it doesn't seem like he got too bogged down in that stuff, but drinking was a problem. And so this is the phase now where he's right there with Johnny Cash and, and Willie Nelson. Later he becomes one of the Highwaymen with that group, but this is way early in the day here where they're just kind of mutual friends, kind of palling around in the same circles, going to the same bars, doing the same things. Well, you can imagine, Kris's wife signed up to be married to this promising young Rhodes Scholar who was in the Army and like this straight-laced dude. And she was not on board with this whole just like drop everything and move to Nashville and become a hippie plan. Because really, I mean, he's suddenly making like $60 a week or something. And that is not what she signed up for. And so there's a lot of conflict in that marriage early on. And they have 2 kids that he loves. But that, and actually, so they get divorced, but partly because that his mom in that same fit of writing that letter is like telling his wife to leave him. She's like, you should get out of there while you can, kind of thing. And so his early marriage falls apart, like easily foreseeable, kind of. So ironically, that forces him. So now all of a sudden he's got alimony payments to make. And that forces him to take up work that he would not have otherwise taken up. So he's living in Nashville, but he would do a week on and a week off. So he would be in Nashville for a week, and then the next week he would drive down to Louisiana. He got a job flying helicopters for an oil company. So he was flying guys back and forth to oil rigs out in the Gulf. They're like 50 miles off the coast or something. So his whole job was to like pick dudes up, take them to the oil rigs, and then take guys back. He was just back and forth flying a helicopter. Being a helicopter pilot is a nice like fallback job to have in your pocket, I guess. But he didn't want to do that permanently. And so he would do that and then drive back to Nashville. So he'd like, I mean, that's a long drive. I mean, that's, anyway. So, but that's how he did it for a long time, was just like driving back and forth, flying helicopters one week, in Nashville writing songs and playing with people the next week. And he just rotated. But what it did do was it gave him a lot of time to himself, because there was a lot of time spent sitting on an oil rig waiting for the next, person to have to go or whatever. And that's where he writes Me and Bobby McGee. Now, apparently, this song is kind of an interesting, like, little loop, because it starts off a mutual friend, or I think it wasn't Fred Rose, but it was Fred, somebody that I'm gonna forget now, but had a secretary named Bobby McKee with a K-E-E. Bobby McKee, who was like this cute secretary girl, and he pitched the line, "Oh, you should write a song about me and Bobby McKee." Well, first, Kris misheard him, so he thought it was McGee. Secondly, when he found out it was McKee, he was like, well, that doesn't really work anyway. McGee's way better. So he just stuck with the thing that he thought it was initially, and that's how you get this song. And so it's about a girl named Bobby. And but then later when Janis Joplin does it, that name works either way. But most people think of Bobby McGee as a guy, even though it's written about a girl from Kris Kristofferson's perspective. And anyway, so he writes Me and Bobby McGee, sitting on an oil rig. And, quickly thereafter, so this is 1969 when that happens. And he meets Janis Joplin pretty soon after this, and they end up in a brief, romantic relationship. And this is where after that first divorce, Kris Kristofferson is quickly becoming a sex symbol in Nashville, and he leans into that pretty hard in his writing and in his personal reputation. Like he's kind of a ladies' man, and everybody knows it. And there's a couple of funny stories from people that were like touring with him and stuff, saying that it was just ridiculous. Like he didn't even have to try. He would just be like standing and doing nothing in a bar, and girls would just mob him for no reason. And there's a funny story where like there was a mutual friend knew a girl who they said had ruined 4 millionaires by the time she was 21. She was just like kind of putting dudes through the ringer, and had somehow was known for like, kind of being a tough one to handle. And they jokingly were like, oh, we should sick her on Kris and see if that finally calms him down. And so they end up in a cabin. So they're at, this guy's house, but there's like a guest cabin in the back. And Kris was supposed to be staying in that cabin. Well, he invites this, he said, we'll bring in the big gun, or we'll bring in the artillery is what he said. Like just seeing if this girl could have any effect on slowing Kris down. And Kris is supposed to be staying in the cabin, and then, when it comes time to go to bed, he's like, all right, I'm going out there. And they had the girl set up in that. Well, she's like, no, I think I'll just go with Kris. I'll just go, I have my stuff out there or whatever. So him and this girl end up in this cabin by themselves. Then a gigantic blizzard hits and snows everybody in, like 6 feet of snow on the ground. Nobody's going anywhere. And, so they're locked in this cabin, just the two of them, for like 3 days. And his buddy who had invited this girl calls his producer and is like, I'm so sorry. I think I might have killed Kris. He's like, what are you talking about? He's like, I think she might have killed him. I haven't seen any signs of life over there in 3 days. And so now everybody's kind of freaked. He's like, I have a snowcat coming tomorrow to dig us out of here. He's like, but I can't see and I can't get over there. And I haven't, it's been 3 days and I literally might have killed your biggest star. I'm sorry. Just because he thought I don't exactly know why he thought that girl was going to kill Kris Kristofferson, but maybe just for whatever reason, he was worried enough to call his producer and be like, I'm worried and I'm very sorry. And he said the next morning, like the machine comes to go dig him out. Well, he comes downstairs to eat breakfast and Kris Kristofferson is like in his kitchen. And he said he looked like he'd been on a beach in Puerto Rico for a week. He was fine. He was just, like, oh, we're out of food over there. Where's the eggs and the juice and the whatever? And then he went back, just, gets his stuff, goes back to the cabin. And he said later on when they both came out of the cabin, when they dug him out, that girl looked like she'd been hit by a train. He said that it was just a 3-day, like, just Kris Kristofferson. And she's like talking about how she's in love and she's moving to Nashville. And so this guy that thought he was bringing this girl to he thought he was going to match Kris's energy or at least, bring him down a peg, had zero effect on Kris Kristofferson. And he just, the effect was had on her the same way that it was with apparently every other girl in Nashville. And so the joke was that, he said, I think the exact quote I think was, my artillery wasn't even a pop gun. Because it just bounced right off of him and it didn't, he just continues on. But that's the kind of guy Kris Kristofferson is. And he, like I said, and he leans into the whole sex symbol thing. And it does not seem to have slowed him down at all. And even though it was kind of weird, because at the time, country music was not like that. It was not that was kind of salacious, topics or whatever. And he kind of became known as that guy. He's like, oh yeah, Kris writes about sex a lot. And Kris writes about, physical stuff a lot. And, but he was just crazy talented and his songs were great. So that was just who he was. So, and so Janis Joplin and him have a brief thing, kind of during this same time. And, but they break up, but remain friends just because their schedules were so chaotic. But they always had a high opinion of each other, even after they broke up. And so he actually, I think that was during his second marriage, actually. So he gets married again to her last name was Beer, I remember. Frances Beer, yeah. So he'd been married again, but him and Janice were kind of having a thing on the side, like prior to that, like, and kind of during and towards the end. And so 1970. So this is a few years into this thing. So, you know, I think he moved to Nashville in 60, let's see here, 1965, I think. Yeah. Oh, no, Frances Beer was his first wife. Okay, so that's like towards the end of his first marriage is when him and Janis Joplin end up together. And this is also, okay, so kind of during the same time window here. So now that he's established as a songwriter and he's around Johnny Cash and he's kind of like, they're becoming friends. Well, he's still in the Army National Guard part of the time. And he's a certified pilot. So one day he has, I think it was for Sunday Morning Coming Down. So he writes this song, which is, a famous, it's a famous Johnny Cash song, but it's also famous for Kris Kristofferson. And so he writes that in Nashville because he describes it like it was because Sunday mornings, like none of the bars were open till 1. Families are out and about. He's like, it's not like the Saturday was kind of the singles day and Sunday was the family's day. And he's just describing the story of walking down the steps out of his apartment and just kind of that experience of coming down on a Sunday morning and like just looking around at all the happy people around him and just kind of feeling down about himself. And, but yeah, so he writes this song, and I think it was for that song. He wants to pitch it to Johnny Cash. Cut to Johnny Cash wakes up one morning, and June Carter is like, hey, some idiot is landing a helicopter on our front lawn. And Johnny kind of wakes up and goes outside, and sure enough, there's Kris Kristofferson landing an Army National Guard helicopter on his lawn, gets out with a beer in one hand and the tape in the other. I was like, hey, I got a song for you. And it like made enough of an impression. It worked. And Johnny picks the song up. And let's see here. I think that was, that had to be in the late 70s by the time that happened. But anyway, so backing up a little bit here. So 69 is when he writes Sunday Morning Coming Down. And, Johnny Cash covered it in 1970, which, that's an interesting timeline hitch there because I know that Johnny Cash and June Carter maybe that was 1968 they got married. Yeah. Okay. So that does make sense. But anyway, so he lands a helicopter in Johnny Cash's front yard and pitches him a song. So, okay, now soon after, in 1970, this is where October 4th of 1970, Janis Joplin dies, I think from a heroin overdose. Yeah. And it crushes Kris Kristofferson because they were still friends and they were very close, and he just thought of her as this like kindred spirit person. And, so she dies of an overdose. So she had recorded Me and Bobby McGee, which is probably one of her most famous songs now. So she records Me and Bobby McGee, and then she dies like 2 weeks later. So it's the same thing that happened with Hank Williams and when he died. One of his biggest hits comes out a few days after he died. So it was like her name was in the news already, and then they put this song out. Well, when she died, Kris didn't know that she had already recorded that song. And so he was, happy, but, further emotionally impacted by, that song being shown to him after the fact, that he had this kind of a send-off memory of Janis Joplin. And it goes to number 1, almost immediately. So he talks about how it was kind of conflicting because he was obviously like, simultaneously, he's got a number 1 hit out that he wrote. And that's like for songwriters, that's, hey, you made, that's the top of the pile. And at the same time, it's from his friend who died, who he was very close to. So his like, those two emotions are competing with each other almost instantly. He's just crushed by it, but also experiencing this crazy success that now he feels guilty about. And so that was a real kind of emotional, to call it a speed bump would be a drastic understatement. It impacted him hard. And, but now, and then, that really does kind of drags his career up into the spotlight, and he starts getting all kinds of work, and he's writing all kinds of cool songs. And he's, let's see here. So 1970, 72, 73, he starts getting into making movies now too, which is Kris Kristofferson's movie career and like film career is its own crazy thing. Like I embarrassingly so, I don't know if I want to like admit this on camera or not, but when I was a kid, I remember seeing the first Blade movie, and Kris Kristofferson is in that movie. Which I learned today it came out in 1998, which I didn't think it was that long ago, but apparently it was. And so I remember seeing his character. I had no idea who he was because I was, I guess, 19, not to, do too much math, but I was somewhere around 6 years old, I guess, when that movie came out. And so I see this movie, and I see that guy, and then later I saw an album cover that my dad had that was Kris Kristofferson, and I went, is that the guy from Blade? And my dad kind of shot me a look like, that's what you know him from? Like, that he's the Blade guy to you? This is this is, one of the greatest songwriters of all time. And to my, 7 or whatever year old brain, he was like, oh yeah, it's the Blade guy. I've been educated since. And but like I said, I think he was in like 80 something movies and TV shows. And like, I mean, his credits list is just insane. And, but at the same time here, he also, so the thing about Kris Kristofferson is that he is fiercely smart and opinionated, and he's not one to back down from an argument. And he starts getting involved in like, different causes, and he loved an underdog. And so he, but he was also tied in enough. He was the equivalent of a conspiracy theorist today, even though now, like, if you look back at some of the conspiracy theories he believed in, he was kind of right the whole time, which like there are very few things that I see on his list of things he cared about that people were very upset with him for, that he's proven to be wrong about. Like because he came out later and like, he's one of the first pop culture figures to start talking about how the CIA is flipping all these countries over and, displacing rulers and doing regime change wars and stuff. And even Vietnam, which he was a part of, he quickly wheels around and is like, nope, this is wrong. We shouldn't be doing this. And him and Willie Nelson actually get into a lot of conflict in later years because Kris Kristofferson is one of the first guys to be like, pretty sure the CIA killed JFK. And he was like dying on that hill. He was like, that was not. And now that's a popular thing to talk about. And it's funny to be like the idea that there are people walking around set and like fully believe with no doubt that JFK was killed by a lone gunman. Like, those people are in the minority now. Back then, that was the story. The government said it, and the government wouldn't lie about something like that. And so everybody believed the Lee Harvey Oswald story, and Kris Kristofferson is up there saying, no, that's got the CIA's fingerprints all over it, which was a crazy thing I mean, even now, that's not 100% accepted across the world, but I think that's probably more accepted than the lone gunman idea. But at the time, it made people kind of back away from Kris Kristofferson. And he wouldn't shut up about causes that he cared about. And he was doing benefit concerts. He was just, and it cost him in the movie and music scene. He lost a lot of work because of that. And, it's interesting. He also got involved even back then. His movie career was harmed by his advocacy for the the Palestinian Children's Fund or a society or something. It was like a financial benefit thing for like the children of people in Palestine, and he was doing these concerts and sending money, and and that pissed off a lot of people in Hollywood, and it slowed him down for a minute there. But anyway, and he seems kind of cavalier about some stuff initially. Like his first thought is, oh, this is an underdog thing? Sure, sign me up, I'll help him out. And then he sort of educates himself on the problem later. So like in one case, I think it might have been his wife, so ends up so the Cesar Chavez thing is going on, right? So we're talking about like migrant worker rights, and like that's a big, like they're unionizing and trying to get better working conditions. And Kris had been kind of unaware, I guess, until I think it was his wife is like, hey, like, do you want to help with this benefit for Cesar Chavez? And he goes, who's that? And she goes, it's for like the migrant workers and stuff. And he goes, oh, the Mexicans? And she's like, yeah, I guess. And he's like, sure, sign me up. I'll do it. And then like, quickly thereafter, Cesar Chavez goes on to say that like initially he was like, oh, this is just another Hollywood star that like they always are really excited initially, and then they do like one thing and then they're gone, and it's you can't get them on the phone anymore. And he says that Kris Kristofferson was like the one exception to that rule, where Kris got involved and stayed involved and was happy to help many times in the future. So that was just kind of the guy he was. Like his initial reaction was like, oh, there's an underdog over there, sure, let's go. And then he built on and stayed in the fight with those guys. And that's like I said, he was not afraid to do that for many a cause. And then and that carried on into late in his life. I mean, he was a big Black Lives Matter guy later, and he did a lot of benefits for different organizations kind of like that. So he kind of just, like I said, he liked an underdog and he liked to be involved. And let's see here. Yeah, in the 90s, he's basically like this thorn in the side of the machine that's just always talking about like, and at the time it was viewed really as like anti-American. It was like unpatriotic to have these opinions, because this is like prime US propaganda phase here. Like Hollywood is cranking out stuff that is built to, to show America in this positive light, despite what we now know the events of the time were. So Kris is out there, what has become known as telling the truth about stuff, and it's really affecting his career. And but anyway, so it continues on here. And let's see here. So then in 1976, I think it was. Oh, so in 1973 he wins a Grammy for Help Me Make It Through the Night, which is probably like, other than having written Me and Bobby McGee, Help Me Make It Through the Night is probably one of the songs that Kris Kristofferson is most known for. Like it's one of his, most influential works. It's still like, I love that song. And so that's 1973. He wins a Grammy for that. And then in 1976, he does a movie with Barbra Streisand, who they had dated briefly in 1970, it sounds like. So this is like a few years after they had dated and broke up. So they had dated after his first marriage there, kind of right around the time, like I said, Joplin died in 1971. So like right in that post first marriage phase where he's just kind of making a name for himself on that front, he's dating Barbra Streisand for part of it. And so then in 76, they do A Star Is Born together. And that was, now we just remade that movie a few years ago with Bradley Cooper and Lady Gaga. Well, that was these guys beforehand with similar star power at the time. And, but the character that Kris Kristofferson is playing is a self-destructive rock star guy, which he kind of was, because his drinking had become a real problem at this point. This is, he's not quite as bad if you look back at footage. Like he's not quite like George Jones level self-destructive, but his drinking is starting to be noticed by people. And he screws up some performances, and he's like, it's starting to become a problem. And then on the set where he's supposed to be playing this self-destructive dude, he really leans into that part, and he's really drunk on set, and he's really forgetting his lines, and he's really making it hard for people. They end up kind of having a conversation with him about it, and a little bit, I don't know if he calls it an intervention, but Barbra Streisand is like, you're killing yourself and you got to stop doing this. Like, this isn't funny, or this is not like an acceptable level of drinking. You got to stop. And it does seem to kind of help, start to turn things around. He does get divorced again though. So he'd gotten remarried to Rita Coolidge in the years before. And but his alcoholism does a good job of finishing that marriage off too. So like right after A Star Is Born comes out, like a year later or something, he gets divorced. And let's see here. So in 1979, he releases a song called "Shake Hands with the Devil," and it's an album, yeah, "Shake Hands with the Devil," and it's one of his less successful albums, but it's kind of about his struggles with alcohol and like, you know, getting out of that alive. Yeah, in one of those songs, he said that he'd modeled the devil after Johnny Cash. So he tells a story, like the song is the story of walking into a bar and like the devil is based, or a devilish character is like, you know, recognizes him as a songwriter, buys him a beer, and like kind of has like a bro down moment with him. And then Kris Lee, and I think the line in the song was like, I didn't beat the devil, but I drank his beer for nothing, or something, I think is the line. Well, when he's writing that song, his devil character was Johnny Cash. And like, I think, you know, and they laugh about that later, but that was, you know, kind of shows you where Johnny Cash was at the time. Because at the time, Johnny was knee deep in killing himself with amphetamines and hadn't quite turned the ship around, I don't think. But anyway, so then we're getting into the 80s here. So 1982, they formed the Highwaymen, which is like their, you know, kind of the, you know, the next claim to fame is, you know, it's him, Willie Nelson, Johnny Cash, and, oh geez, I'm about to leave out one of the other Highwaymen. Waylon Jennings, geez Louise, my brain is not on today. I always want to say that Merle Haggard was in the Highwaymen, and he definitely wasn't, but that's what trips my brain up, is I think of him in that group of guys. But Merle had always kind of kept himself off to the side of that one. And anyway, so 1982, that's where, okay, so in the 70s, he'd started getting all this movie work. 1982, he gets in trouble for supporting the, you know, Palestinian children's rights. And that's where the dent in his movie career comes from. And anyway, so 82, he's in the Highwaymen, so at least his music career is kind of doing okay. And then in 83, he gets remarried to Lisa Myers, and they stay married for the rest of his life. But he stays, you know, he stays relevant and annoying to the establishment throughout the 90s and into the early 2000s here. Because he's doing things like, he got himself in a little bit of hot water in the 90s comparing American patriotism to Nazi Germany. And if you look back at what he was saying, he was drawing the parallels between like the way the German people were propagandized into believing in doing certain things. He sees that at work on the American public. Like our propaganda machine was operating the same way, but it gets blown up as him saying that America is Nazi Germany kind of thing. Like, and that's not what he was trying to communicate. But and you got to imagine country music fans in the 90s, that is not the crowd that you want to be saying that kind of stuff to if you're worried about protecting your image, which Kris was not. He was just going to say what he was going to say, and he was going to keep on keeping on. And there's actually, and you can remember, like, you know, in 2001, obviously, like after 9/11, country music really rallies around the flag. Like there's in hindsight, in kind of a crazy way, like nobody's asking questions and everybody's just full, let's go America mode. And we're, you know, like that's, and even in that environment, Kris Kristofferson is not having any of it. He's immediately back on his anti-war horse, correctly so. And but I guess there was kind of a bit of an altercation between him and Toby Keith, because Toby Keith had the opposite reaction to that. Like, I mean, everybody loves Courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue. And, you know, Toby Keith was, I mean, he's on all the USA tours, like, or the USAA or whatever it was that, like, you know, they go around to war zones and doing concerts for, you know, for soldiers and stuff. Toby Keith was full send, you know, rah, rah, America. And I loved it at the time. I say that as if I didn't. But I love Toby Keith. Like, that's still, Toby Keith is, I mean, he's on my Mount Rushmore of people, but him and Kris Kristofferson really butted heads when this kind of happened. And, like, I guess there was some, you know, kind of chaotic altercation backstage at some event somewhere between them. But like I said, you know, Kris was just not having it. He knew he had seen too much to just be kind of talked into the next war, I guess. And anyway, so, and then in 1998, so like after all of this, 1998 is when he is in the first Blade movie. And that's where I saw him for the first time. And like, so I'd missed, so I can understand my dad's reaction of like, that's what you know him from? Like he's the Blade guy to you? Is kind of well into his life and career here. And then in 2004, he's inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. And let's see here. So he's kind of somewhere in here. That was much later. Okay. He's releasing albums and he's releasing songs, but he doesn't have any like crazy successes in this time. And like I said, I think him butting heads with the industry politically was, the reason why. Like I said, if you're worried about your image, you don't do that, is because you would end up like Kris Kristofferson here, where he doesn't care about his image, he doesn't care about his prospects. He's just going to say what he thinks is true, and that's great, and we love him for it. It did affect his career at the time. He did not, he went through a bit of a slump here, again. And but anyway, so in 2016. Well, 2013, he gets a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award for his contributions to music, which that's at least a nod to his impact and, his writing ability. So then he starts to have some cognitive problems where he's like forgetting words to his songs. He's confused all the time. And he gets diagnosed with Alzheimer's, which everybody, that's, especially at the time, there's not much you could do about that. And so his family is kind of getting ready to have to deal with just a downhill ride from here. But quickly thereafter, like within a couple of months of being diagnosed with Alzheimer's, they go get a second opinion somehow. And somehow this other doctor figures out like Lyme disease was not like, I guess at the time it was not like an obvious thing that you would have thought of for those symptoms, I guess. But anyway, this doctor tests him for Lyme disease and he's positive. And I guess you kind of can treat Lyme disease, and it's like way more than Alzheimer's. So he starts going through treatment for Lyme disease and he starts getting some of his cognitive function back, and he ends up going on tour again. And he does some more concerts and stuff, which everybody had written him off for. So, and this is in, 2016. 2017, he performs at the Glastonbury Festival at age 81. So he went from like, he's probably a downhill ride, to like, he's kind of getting better and enough to actually perform. Like they had, that no one saw that coming. So every performance after 2016 was a bonus for Kris Kristofferson. And let's see here. He gets himself in, like I said, in hot water again in 2020. He's, because he supports Black Lives Matter and he's very vocal about it. And but that's, now we know. Par for the course for Kris Kristofferson. Like that should not have been a shock to anyone that knew that guy. And so in 2020 he stops touring. I'm sure the pandemic had a lot to do with that. And then he died in 2024. So how old was he? 88. Yeah. So he died at his home in Hawaii, kind of peacefully surrounded by family. And I think that's about as good as you're going to get if you're from that generation of people. Like having his life story and that level of excitement and the level of just, doing the dang thing to end up dying peacefully surrounded by your family. That's a pretty good deal, I think. I don't think, and he says in later in interviews later in his life, he said he never thought that he was going to make it that far, that he had imagined, because he kind of idolized Hank Williams too. So he's another one of these guys that was really affected by Hank Williams' death early on. And so even in his 30s, he was saying, like, I think when he said when he was 29, he's like, man, if I'm going to die at the same age as Hank, I better hurry up. I'm going to miss the boat. He was almost like, he almost kind of idealized dying young, but then that seems to wear off pretty quick. But that's, that kind of shows you what gear he was in initially is, when he shows up in Nashville, he's there to get rip roaring and do the dang thing. And, anyway, so that's, he has a long and storied career and then, goes off into the sunset surrounded by family, which I thought was nice. Let's see here. Well, I think that's it for Kris Kristofferson. So thanks for watching and we'll see you next week.